Dr. Fuller, let's go back to the scourging again. From a physiological perspective, what does scourging do to the human body? And I know there's probably a very long answer, but briefly, what without getting into just gory details, what does the scourging do to someone?
There are obviously some, it's a very painful process. As was shown in the movie, they were beating with rods, which they often would do, which would obviously cause some contusion, some bruising. But using the flagrum, what that would actually do, besides bruising and causing superficial lacerations as you got into it, the sharp edges of that flagrum would actually cut into the deeper subcutaneous tissues, the blood vessels, and even to the muscle tissue, and it would rip the muscle apart, rip the fat apart. And as that would happen, you would get a lot of extensive bleeding. And it was actually the blood loss that probably did the most damage to the individual. Sure, it hurt. There was a lot of bruising, and there were a lot of cuts that would be very painful. There was tissue damage and swelling, which obviously would interfere with the function of that tissue. But you experienced a lot of volume loss, and that volume loss would end up causing circulatory problems to just not only the muscle tissue and to the extremities, but eventually to some of the end organs, like your kidneys, your lungs, your heart, your brain. And it was through this volume loss ultimately that would result in kind of a quicker death upon the cross. It was said that if your scourging was mild, then you would spend a longer time on the cross during crucifixion. If you had more severe scourging, because of the extensive volume loss, then your death was relatively quick on the cross. And from what we know of Jesus, he had a very severe scourging.
Let's shift gears just a little bit, guys. Let's go back to the trial a little bit more in depth here. And Brandon, I want to address this question to you. And one of the things that I think amazes me most as we watch this depiction of the trials, and we know that this is true because of what we read in Scripture, but Jesus was, for all intents and purposes, silent. We read that he said a few things, and they were obviously very important things, but that's very different from what we would see today on a trial. We would see, maybe even in a courtroom that Judge Greer presides over, or on a television show, which again we know is Hollywoodized, for a lack of a better term. But is Jesus' decision to limit his response theologically significant?
Yeah. And it is very different than what you would see on Judge Judy, and I know you're a big fan.
I am.
But
my wife's an even bigger fan.
Yeah.
So.
But seriously, when you look at Jesus, again, we go back to the Messianic prophecies, and every one of those had to be fulfilled in order for him to be validated as the Messiah. One of the Messianic prophecies was that like a sheep is silent before her shearers, so did he not open his mouth. And so as Jesus stands there, and as he is silent, and as he doesn't give much of a defense, as he stands quiet, it is the fulfillment of that Messianic prophecy that came 600 years earlier. Now, here's why that can pose problems. Bible critics, like a guy named John Hicks, in 1977, he was a British theologian, and he wrote a book called The Myth of the Incarnation. And he looks at the silence of Jesus, and he makes an argument, along with about 6 other colleagues, that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, and he never claimed to be the Son of God. And so Christians have gone and embellished a lot of things in the aftermath when they actually wrote the Gospels, added things to them that were not true of Jesus, simply because he didn't say a lot. I certainly would not agree or fall into that camp. Instead, I think we need to look at this, one, again, as a fulfillment of Messianic prophecy, but I think there are other details that you can look at and realize, yes, Jesus really did claim to be the Messiah. In one scene, he says, "It is as you say," and that's about all that he says. Here's a guy who's getting ready to be crucified and put to death because of his claims to be God in human flesh. And so I don't think Hicks' book holds a great deal of water. I think you could look at other things. Specifically, you could look at the fact that there's a sign over his head on the cross that identifies him as the King of the Jews. You also see Jesus granting forgiveness to one of the criminals on the cross. Again, only something that can be done by God himself with any degree of credibility. There are other scholars, and I would not necessarily fall into this camp, but there are other scholars who would say that if you look at Jesus, Jesus had 12 followers, and it's significant that he does not include himself as one of the 12, because there's a representation in the New Testament that's compared to the Old Testament, and the Old Testament had 12 tribes of Israel. And so God is the one who organizes the 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament. Jesus is one who's organizing 12 in the New Testament. And so again, that's indicative of the fact that he is God. And so there are all types of arguments and all types of points that could be made. But we have to understand that that ultimately is the fulfillment of prophecy. It's not Jesus denying that he is the Son of God or the Messiah. In fact, other scholars like Robert Stein will say that the reason Jesus didn't make a big deal out of messiahship is because Jesus understood that among the Jewish people there were all types of political implications that were tied very closely to the term Messiah. And so instead of thinking or speaking about himself as the Messiah, he would use terms like the Son of Man more frequently.